In this video, we are going to have a look at the Tamron 20mm f2.8 lens for the Sony E mount cameras. We will talk about what are the pros and cons of this affordable ultra wide angle prime lens. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the Tamron 20mm f2.8. So in the last video we already looked at the 24mm and the 35mm. So this is the last of this trio compact prime lens that Tamron has just recently released for the Sony E mount camera system. If you haven't already checked out my Tamron 24 and 35mm f2.8 prime lens review, go check it out now. I put a link here, so go check it out first and then come back and watch this review. And if you have already checked out that review, so now let's get started. This Tamron 20mm f2.8 lens is the widest of the trio compact prime lens that Tamron has just released. The 20mm ultra wide angle focal length should be very suitable for doing landscape photography or astrophotography as well. If you mount it on an APS-C E mount camera, then the equivalent focal length will now be 35mm, which make it a very versatile focal length for you to capture many different kind of everyday photos. The construction of this lens is pretty much the same as the 24 and 35 f2.8 lens. It feels a little bit plasticky if you hold it, but it's made of good quality plastic, and the body is also quite light. One thing quite interesting is that the length of this lens is 64mm, which is exactly the same as the 24mm and the 35mm. Tamron purposely designed all these three lenses to have exactly the same length, and not only that, the filter thread, the front filter thread is 67mm, so it is also the same for all these three lenses. And also this is the same filter for the Tamron 17 to 28 2.8 and also the 28 to 75 2.8 lens for the E mount camera. Tamron just intentionally make it this way so that you can share the filter between all these lenses. The position of the front element will change when you are changing the focus, but the overall length of the lens wouldn't change. That means you don't have to worry too much when you are taking close-up or macro photos. And yes, this lens can also do 1 to 2 magnification close-up or macro photos. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on in this review. While the lens may feel a little bit plasticky, but Tamron actually has already included the environmental seal to the lens. So for example, if you look at the rear of the lens, there is a little bit of rubber seal near the edge, so that is to help protect against weather when you are out shooting under rain. The front element also has fluorine coating to give you some protection against rain and dirt. One thing I want to mention is that when the lens is mounted on the A7 body, it just feels very balanced. I think both the weight and also the length of the lens perfectly match to a Sony A7 camera. The overall autofocus performance is okay. It is definitely not the fastest autofocus lens in the market, and the autofocus also has a little bit of noise, but it does support the IAF on the Sony cameras, and I have no issue with the autofocus accuracy even when I'm taking close-up photos. I've also tried it on a Nikon Z6 using the TechRT ZE-01 adapter, and the overall autofocus performance is actually very good. It just almost feels like if it was natively mounted on a Sony body. If you want to do manual focus with this lens, because the manual focus is by wire, so there is definitely a little bit of delay when you are turning the focus ring. I don't really think it's a big deal, but you do need a little bit of time to get used to it. As I mentioned earlier in this review, this Tamron 20mm lens also has the macro capability. It has the maximum magnification of 1 to 2, so that is very good feature, because you can just use this lens to take some close-up or macro photos without having to bring another dedicated macro lens. The only thing you have to be a bit careful is that when you are taking photo at the closest focus distance for a 1 to 2 magnification photo, the front element would be very close to the object that you are shooting, so just have to be careful, don't cast any shadow on the object, and also it may be a little bit tricky if you want to use some fresh or external light to light up your object. But other than that, you can definitely take some very beautiful and very sharp macro photo using this lens. And also when you're taking macro photos, the background blur, the bokeh is also very beautiful as well. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about the image quality, and as usual start with the image sharpness first. At the maximum aperture f2.8, if you look at this photo and zoom in a little bit, you can see that the center sharpness is already very well even at the maximum aperture. If you look at the corner, I would say the corner is still very usable, but compared to the center, you can definitely see that the corner is a little bit softer. If you stop down to f4, the center doesn't actually change much because at the maximum aperture, the center sharpness is already very good. If you look at the corners, you can see that the corners is a little bit sharper when you stop down to f4. If you stop down a little bit more to f5.6, I think this is the setting that you can get the maximum sharpness from the center all the way to the corners. Distortion wise, there is definitely quite a bit of distortion when you are taking photo using this 20mm f2.8 lens. If you look at this sample photo, you can definitely see there is quite a bit of distortion, especially near the top and the bottom of the photo. Fortunately, because the lens has the image correction profile embedded into the lens, you can just turn on the distortion correction feature on your camera, then the output would have very minimal amount of distortion. Lens flare is surprisingly well controlled. Even when I'm shooting directly into the sun, I have very minimal amount of lens flare when I'm shooting at the maximum aperture or when I stop down. And even when I do the night lens flare testing by shooting into a bright light in the dark area, I still got very minimal amount of lens flare or ghosting. Definitely very surprised by how well this Tamron lens managed to control lens flare and ghosting even when I was shooting under the most challenging lighting condition. When shooting at the maximum aperture f2.8, you will notice a bit of vignetting. Stop down to f4 would improve quite a bit, but if you are really concerned about vignetting, stop down to f5.6 and vignetting is virtually unnoticeable when you are taking real-world photos. As a fast-ish ultra-wide angle lens, I think a lot of people would be interested to use this Tamron 20mm lens to do a bit of astrophotography. So I took some photo of the sky at night using this lens at the maximum aperture just to see how the image quality is like. If you look at this sample photo and zoom in even to 200%, and even if we move to the edges and corner, there is very minimal amount of chroma, so that is a very good news because that means you can definitely use this lens to shoot some astrophoto even at the maximum aperture. Chromatic aberration is generally maintained at pretty minimal level. If you like sun stars, I would suggest shooting at aperture f11 or smaller. Camera lens design is always about compromise. You are compromising between different aspects of the image quality, for example, the sharpness, bokeh quality, distortion, and you're also compromising between other things about the lens, for example, the size, the weight, and the price. So if you look at this Tamron lens and also the two other prime lenses that they have released recently, you can clearly see that Tamron is not chasing for the best possible image quality. I don't mean the image quality of this lens is bad or anything like that. It's definitely not the case. Instead of chasing for 100% perfect image quality in every single area, they create something that is good enough for most users, but because of that, it allowed them to create a lens that is not too big, not too heavy, and not too expensive. So overall, that means it is a more practical lens compared to some other lenses that may have better image quality, but it may become a lot heavier and a lot more expensive. So for most users that don't have unlimited budget, this Tamron lens is probably a more sensible choice unless you really want the absolute best image quality and don't mind carrying a bigger and heavier camera bag. In the last couple of years, I think a lot of manufacturers, when they are designing the new lens, they put a very heavy focus on the image quality and the numbers. Everyone seems to want to create the lens that is sharper, faster, with a bigger aperture. So it's quite refreshing to see Tamron is using a different and more balanced approach when they are designing these new prime lenses for the Sony E cameras.